Hello everybody, this is Hashim of Iqtisadiyat or Hashim of Economics, and today our guest is Professor Yoshiko Herrera. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let me introduce you to our listeners. Yoshiko Herrera is a professor of political science here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research focuses on Russian politics, nationalism, identity, ethnic politics, national accounts and state statistics, political economy, and international norms. At UW-Madison, Professor Herrera teaches courses on comparative politics, social identity and diversity, and post-communist politics. She has gotten her Ph.D. from University of Chicago, Political Science Department, and prior to arriving to Madison in 2007, she was a professor of social sciences at the government department at Harvard University. Outside of classroom, I know that you are a public speaker that attends a lot of panels on relations between the United States and Russia and NATO. I think that's what I know about you as a professor. And so my first question will be this. I know that you have been teaching a class on Russian invasion to Ukraine. And so can you start telling us why did Russia invade Ukraine in 2022?
Oh, okay. Yes, I'm teaching a class, the second year actually of the class. I started it in 2022. It used to be, I think from the start of the invasion, it was a little bit more of a question because it was surprising to some people. But I think at this point we have basically three answers to that. One has to do with the imperial ideology, and that is the reconstitution of the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union, that sort of space of the former Russian Empire. I think that imperial ideology, there's just been much more evidence of that from Russian officials, from Putin himself. So I think that's one factor. I think another factor has to do with Putin's understanding of Russian national identity and this sense of humiliation of the 1990s, the weakness of Russia vis-a-vis NATO, and the myth of World War II, the mythologizing of the victory over Nazi Germany, and different elements that feed into this sense of Russian grievances, including NATO expansion and the symbolism of that. So I think that's a second. And I think the third thing is just a set of miscalculations on the part of Russia about what the response would be. Number one, not expecting Ukrainian resistance, despite so much evidence that was likely. Expecting the West to be divided, to not really come to Ukraine's support, thinking that prior military victories in Syria, Chechnya, etc., went unpunished, and that Georgia, 2008, that this would happen again. So I think that sanctions would be weak. There was just a series of miscalculations in addition to these kind of larger identity and ideological interests.
So if we talk about the root causes of invasion, would you think that, as a researcher of identity politics and nationalism and separatism, if we look at the current war through that lens, what can we learn about, the intents?
Well, one is that the interest in Russia is not limited just to a specific part of the territory of Ukraine. So this isn't about just control of Donbass or just control of Crimea, or if they had just a certain amount of territory, they would be satisfied. I think that the overall understanding, in my view, is that Russia wanted essentially political control of Ukraine and the former Soviet states. So this is, in other words, a denial of sovereignty. That is sovereignty in the sense of being free from external threats. It's a denial because it's saying, as long as Ukraine and other former Soviet states follow what Russia wants, then it's okay. Mm-hmm. But if they go against Russia, then we'll use different levers to try to get control of them again, political and economic pressure, which is, I think, the story of post-1991 Ukraine and Russia, of Russia constantly trying to exert control in different ways. But that really failed decisively with the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And then with the invasion of Crimea, the ability to control Ukraine politically with somebody like Yanukovych, etc., that strategy had failed. So I think that what's the larger lesson is that, unfortunately, for other former Soviet states, as long as they agree with what Russia's asking, then they're not going to be invaded. But if they go against Russia, this really puts them at threat. I mean, currently Russia is tied down with Ukraine.
Yeah.
The Baltic states left fairly decisively, which, you know, they're still mad about in Russia. But I think the lesson is that there is an expansionist view of Russia, of having this right, their way they see it. They have a right to control this area, and I think they're going to exercise that right if they're challenged.
How much these grievances are coming from the society versus it's coming from sort of the elites or the Putin himself?
Yeah, this is a good question. I think on the one hand, there's no question that the decision to go to war was Putin's. So
Correct. Yeah.
I think there's no question about that. But certain of the grievances and some aspect of this imperialist ideology is also shared within the society. And I think not just from public opinion post-war do you see some support for the war, but also NATO expansion has been not just unpopular in Russia, but conceived of as kind of illegitimate double-crossing by the West of Russia, that Russia had agreed to allow Germany to reunify and then there wouldn't be NATO expansion. So the idea of NATO expansion is that the West tricked Russia by doing this. And so I think there are some elements that resonate with the population. That's one. The World War II ideology, the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, is very popular, but also the portrayal of Ukraine as not a real country, as corrupt, as subject to Nazi elements. Nazi understood in terms of anti-Russian or anti-Soviet, not as anti-Jewish or the way that we understand it in the West. So I think there are elements of Putin's framing of the war that resonate in society, even though the proximate decision to invade was his.
So if we kind of follow through some of the sentiments in Russian media, a lot of times the portrayal of Ukraine as a not real state, or like, I'm sure you have watched some popular series like, I don't know, Brat, for example, or something, right? Like, where people talk about how sort of Ukrainians are portrayed there, like being, there was this feeling of eventual revenge that they have to take on, and the Sevastopol being this sort of almost a holy site for World War II and its consequences. And it felt for some that it was Putin, early Putin at least, who was saying that, the question of Crimea is set. We will not kind of re-question it. And the society was sort of more anti-Ukraine than early Putin. And then towards the end of the term, there was some sort of a convergence between public opinion against sort of Ukraine's sovereignty and that of the elites. How much we can trust that line of thinking?
I think that within society, there's always, in every society, there's stereotypes and there's impressions and there's prejudices, like, everywhere. But I think the question is, like, when it comes down to pursuing those, the costs and the benefits of that, it might be one thing to have like a negative impression of a group, but it doesn't mean, there's always a gap between attitudes and action.
Correct. Yeah.
So even in Russia, let's say in terms of prejudice against groups, like the most disliked groups in Russia by a lot of public opinion polling pre-war were Chechens and Roma, for example. But the level of violence committed by people in society, it's nowhere near the level of attitudes. So attitudes were always much more negative. Like, maybe you find 60% of people have a negative attitude towards Chechens, let's say, but 60% of the population isn't willing to go out and beat somebody up on the street. So in terms of actually doing something about it, there's a gap between, there's a small percentage of society that's willing to go and fight and commit
Correct.
violence,
Yeah.
but there's a larger percent of society that's willing to support it attitudinally. So within the society, and that's true, everywhere, because as it turns out, violence is committed by young men more than by babies or old people, right, or by women. So there's always a gap, but that's the question: is like, how much can public support be turned into support for widespread violence? And I think that's more of a question mark. There's no question there was negative attitudes and kind of prejudice and kind of imperial haughtiness, of looking down at of non-Russian peoples. So even in the Soviet friendship of peoples, it was always unequal. It was always there's a host and there's guests. There was never like a universalistic, we are all equals on the same level. It's like we're the generous ones inviting you.
The Rus that объединила, meaning like the Russian.
Yes. There's Russia is the хозяин, right? So okay, there's always that kind of prejudice, but in terms of like, what does it take for society to support a war where, the low estimates are of, let's say 66,000 killed in Russia, but up to 100,000 killed in 2 years of war, with wounded and missing another 100,000 or so. So it's like enormously costly war. And what does it take for people not just to have like a general sense of prejudice, but be willing to say like, yes, that's fine. It's fine that in Afghanistan in 10 years we lost 16,500 people, and now we've lost so many more times that, and I'm not going to protest. That's okay. So this is, I think, the thing that's kind of puzzling is like, not just do you have a background attitude of prejudice or dislike of a group, but you're willing to support a very costly action against another people.
I see. Because my understanding was when it comes to Caucasus, or like the negative attitudes towards northern Caucasian people like Chechens or Dagestanis and so forth, which a lot of times they don't differentiate, right? Like it's all like all one. I thought that the attitudes don't transfer to sort of actions is because they know that the Northern Caucasus is subjugated, like they won the Chechen war, sort of, like Chechnya is part of it, and then resentment towards Ukrainians or the Baltic states was more like, the sort of the negative sentiment that came through this was that almost like they're biding their time to like actually take this revenge. And for Caucasus it was like, we don't like them, but then they're our subjects, sort of like second-class citizens. But the Ukrainians are not second-class citizens per se.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a couple of things there. One is, I think there's an interesting issue about the group identity. And the Russian view towards Ukrainians is not like Hitler views towards Jews.
Correct.
As
like that,
completely different people, a subspecies. No. It's more like apostates.
Exactly.
Like they are bad Russians.
Correct. Yeah.
They're doing the wrong thing. If they were doing the right thing, they would speak Russian, they would acknowledge our power and greatness, and they would subjugate themselves to us. And so they could choose the right path, but they are choosing the wrong path.
And they're being misled by the West or something.
Yes. The West is always like up to no good.
Do they give them agency in this equation, or is it more like?
I think it's a mix. They think that NATO is brainwashing people, Nazi brainwashing. Yeah, the leadership is doing the wrong thing. But I think they also blame Ukrainians that continue to speak Ukrainian, or Ukrainians that continue to have a Ukrainian flag or something like that. So I think they do blame the West, and they blame the leadership, but they also blame individuals, and you see that in the atrocities.
Correct, yeah.
So I think the difference is that Ukrainians could be Russian, but they're from the Russian perspective. They could be good Russians, but they're choosing to do the wrong thing. So that's a little bit different from the, this group is totally different from us and separate. That's one thing. I don't know, on the timing of the war and why now. There's some people, including Ukrainians, that claim that if you look at Russian ideology, it's consistently anti-Ukrainian. They're always trying to do this, and ever since the end of the Soviet Union, they've been wanting to do this. Okay, so that's a view that's out there. I think that actually, if you can imagine a scenario where Yanukovych, who was elected president of Ukraine, right? If he had somehow not signed the association agreement with Europe with the EU in 2013, but somehow not faced the Euromaidan protests, if the people hadn't gone and protested, and maybe if he didn't use violence against them and spur even more protests, if somehow he managed to not sign the agreement and stay in power, and let's say Russia provided them with some benefits of some economic benefits, something, it's possible that they would have said, okay, like, things are working the way we want. Our guy is in power, and the Russian language has a status that we want it to have. Like, why invade? So I think that it's very plausible. I mean, this is another argument that the war might have been might have been not necessary had other political actions succeeded. Now, you could say eventually those were all going to fail because Ukrainians were going to reject them, but I think that I don't think it was inevitable that Putin was going to invade if he had managed to get political control over Ukraine some other way. And there were other people besides Yanukovych. Let's say Zelensky had fled on
February 25th or something.
Yes, let's say he had fled and just said, okay, I'm going to Dubai. Like, I didn't want to be in politics anyways. Similar to 2014, imagine a scenario where a lot of the top leadership of Ukraine switched sides, or top people in the military switched sides. Now, that's implausible because if you were paying attention to Zelensky's victory in 2019 and also to the sorting that happened after 2014 in Ukraine, if you were paying attention, you would see that a lot of the pro-Russian elements already left post-2014. So who was left in Ukraine was much more, much more pro-Ukrainian elements. But, okay, in a scenario where somehow the leadership had left or defected, then maybe they wouldn't have had the will to fight back. But you can imagine also these Western nationalist elements, would they have just said okay to that? I mean, maybe there would have been something else. So I think the more plausible story for the delay of the war would have been the continued governance of Yanukovych somehow maintaining power, even if tenuously so, because then why invade if you have him there?
I see. Yeah, I mean, I also made this mistake, and sort of analytical, if you will, that Russia would invade, because I was in Kiev in last days of December before the war, so like about 50 days before the war started, and I, spoke with people, obviously, and so on, and kind of, it sounds like a cliche sort of Tom Friedman sort of thing, like a taxi driver. He is Russian speaking, doesn't speak Ukrainian, and he was telling me that there was this invasion in the air in December. If you remember, they were putting their troops there since fall, and the taxi driver casually mentioning it. If they invade, I'm going to fight. Although I don't speak, Ukrainian, but I'm like a Ukrainian guy, and then if Putin, and I was like, okay, if a random taxi driver is willing to fight, then the KGB or Russian FSB would know that, like things that I am seeing, and they would think, no, this is unpopular, and they would not. So when I came back, I was like, it's unlikely because it feels like all the Ukrainians are willing to fight, and invading a place where everybody is willing to fight is sort of irrational. I mean,
Yeah.
that was my thinking, and then it kind of went away. But I guess my sort of question and understanding, and then trying to figure one thing out was that there's this issue of sort of capabilities versus intent, right? Like, so capability wise, obviously the war didn't go as Russia wanted to or Putin wanted to be, but in terms of intents and like this myth of короткая победоносная война, short victorious war. I feel like if it was sort of successful, the war, the way that Putin imagined it to be, I'm thinking that he was thinking that, would that part of society in Russia that is anti-war right now wouldn't exist? How would you? So in Russia we have people who don't like the war, but and I think they don't like it because it's unsuccessful, not because of because of it. So what do you think on that?
Well, okay, I will say also, let's say anecdotally speaking, from a trip to Ukraine.
Okay.
In October 2023.
Okay.
Okay, so after the war started, I think one thing, and in October 2023, it wasn't looking. I mean, the last few months have been kind of like depressing.
Really rough. Yeah.
Yeah, but okay. It looked like initially Ukraine fought back. Okay, they're going to fight back. There's no way Russia can win. Okay. But then if you go up to this, where this Hostomel airport was, and Bucha, Irpin, and these places, you see how close Russia came to taking over Kiev. You can see even in Kiev these so-called hedgehogs, which is a new word for me. I mean, the new English word. I didn't know this word in English.
Oh, they call it the hedgehogs too?
No, I don't think we have a word in English. I don't think we know what those things are.
Oh, okay.
But everyone that's a visitor to Russia knows this from the road from Sheremetyevo into Moscow.
In
that you see this.
Shosсе, right? Yeah.
Yes. So, but you see those things in Kiev, and you see how close this airport is to Kiev, and you see how close those towns of Bucha, Irpin are. And you realize, like, they got very close, and also you see the damage, like the incredible damage along this Irpin River. Even still, some villages just like
obliterated. Right?
Yes, obliterated. Like every fence has, bullet holes all over it. Buildings just reduced to rubble, and that's really close. And I mean, we know the big stories of where the atrocities were, where the Russian side was. Those are mostly rebuilt. But where the Russians were not, where there weren't a lot of sort of war crimes, there was the destruction of those villages that are still destroyed. So I think it got closer than maybe it looked externally. So there could have been, so the scenario of Zelensky fleeing is one, but another is Russia might not have executed the plan as poorly as it did. And I think it actually was scarier than it seemed in 2020. In, let's say, by summer or fall 2022, it looked like, the Russians are just so disorganized, so bad. And I think it actually was like a bit scarier than it seemed. And now, of course, it's scary with the front. Okay, but so would there be the Russian opposition to it? And I agree that some of the Russian opposition is to the war going badly and being costly. But if we go back to the Crimea example, that's maybe indicative of what it would have been like had
this been a short
had it been a short victorious war, right? We would have had all this Krimnash and all this,
What do you call post-Crimea consensus? That's the word they use, right?
However, there were still people Nemtsov was a critic, for example, of Crimea. And he, of course, he was killed in 2015. So I don't think there would have been.
But it was close to unanimous, though.
Yeah, but I think.
And even Navalny, I would say, a lot of people criticize him because of that, right?
Yes, although again, it comes in a way, the way that Crimea unfolded with not a lot of casualties, not a lot of apparent resistance. I mean, of course, like there's like caveats to all that, but there wasn't a lot of people killed. There wasn't a lot of apparent resistance. And so in some ways saying, well, this was great. Like, look, we got back this vacation land and it was like basically costless. To me, that's kind of support makes more sense to me than somebody saying like, oh, 200,000 or 300,000 casualties, like, great. I mean, this is harder to understand. So I think it's possible that there would have been less opposition, even though there's not as much opposition as you think there should be in Russia, but there might have been less if it had been shorter and successful. But again, like, I don't think it would have been, I don't think it would have actually been successful. I mean, they might have been able to take much more of the eastern part with less resistance, but I just cannot foresee a way in which all of Ukraine, all 43 million people, the whole territory just submits to Russia. I just find it hard to imagine that scenario.
I mean, unless, again, like in their caricature mind, Ukrainians are apostates or people who don't have agency. They're fooled by the West or whatever, right? So in that model of theirs, then they would say, okay, if we just take the top brass of they call it junta, right? Like, meaning like basically not a legitimate sort of ruling party. So
yeah, but I think okay, this is speculative, but I think there would have been partisan nationalist
movements,
movements, especially in the West.
Yeah, I guess why I'm keep on asking this is that I also when the war started, like I think like everybody, I was trying to make sense of it, and so one of the examples was the Chechen wars, the first and second, and so the first Chechen war, we know that it has been quite unpopular. So there was a lot of within Russian opposition to that, and Nemtsov probably is one of the prime examples. Nazarbayev, like a lot of people were for peace against the war, and then when Putin came. After they signed a peace treaty for people. I think a lot of our listeners know it, but just like, and so when Putin came, the second Chechen war started. Then, and it felt there was a little less opposition to the second one.
For sure.
And my take on this, from this Ukrainian example of Crimea and Ukraine, was that, there was an opposition to the Chechen war by Yeltsin because of how poorly executed the war was in their eyes. Because, they saw a lot of blood, the kids dying, mothers against, remember like this mothers committees against the war. It was reservists, not the professional military fighting. There was this movies by Nevzorov and all this. So I thought this was not a question of like, again, it was a question of sort of capabilities versus intent. It wasn't the idea of the war was bad that people opposed it in the first time. And then the second time they didn't oppose it, again, not because of idea. And so I was thinking that had it been this war painless as they would imagine, which is I agree, which is a hell of a take, which may not have happened. But like what I'm kind of afraid of is that if Ukraine was weaker, or if there is another country which is weaker than Ukraine, let's say like Belarus become democratic or something, then it seems like the Russian society may actually support it. Like that's something I cannot like square.
Actually I have a recent article just came out comparing Chechen wars to the Ukraine war in post-Soviet affairs.
Is it with Kafanov and
those are these papers on Eurasia and what is Eurasia. But this is with Marat Ilyasov, who's Chechen scholar actually. So I think in your general point of like, if there was kind of a let's say low cost invasion, would Russians support it? And the answer is probably yes, because it's low cost. So like, why not? I think Georgia in 2008, this Northern Ossetia, Southern Ossetia, like, well, okay, like whatever, we have our troops there, like whatever, that's fine. The Transnistria, like people aren't really paying attention. Like here are these Russian troops, like here and there, like it's fine. So I think if it's low cost in a certain way, okay, it's low cost, it makes sense. But another element is not just the capabilities But the media control, so there's the military. I think what we analyze in this article comparing Chechnya and Ukraine is the political strategy, the media strategy, and the military strategy. And between the two Chechen wars, there's a huge dehumanization campaign of Chechens as terrorists.
Yeah.
And then, not to mention the apartment bombings in 1999, that now is getting a lot more scrutiny. So I think preparing people for the Second Chechen War through media and also through different incidents, I think is part of the reason for the change in support within Russia. But also, Russia completely controlled the media environment in Chechnya. It controlled access. Yes, in the Second War. So it didn't control in the First War. But in the Second War, it controlled. By then, Putin had full control over TV and other media, not internet, but TV. Remember, actually, all these things from the 90s. Remember, NTV in the First Chechen War was anti-government, and who was exiled? Berezovsky and Kuczynski, right? So the media control was an important element in general of Putin's political strategy in general in Russia. But controlling the narrative on Chechnya was important. And I actually think they're kind of, as they say, drinking their own Kool-Aid in terms of the Ukraine war, thinking if we say Bucha never happened, or that Ukrainians did it themselves, or that it's fake, that people will believe that. Well, maybe some people in Russia are believing that, but externally people do not believe that. So they don't have the support of international community in Ukraine at all. And they continue with their own internal narrative as if this is convincing without really understanding, they're not in control at all of the Ukraine narrative, whereas they were in Chechnya. So I think when it comes to another post-Soviet state...
So can I just interrupt here? So in Chechnya, you're saying for the world, Russia was the only source of information in the Second Chechen War? And
I think it was the main source.
And then in the Ukraine war, they are not.
Yes.
And that's why the world's reaction is also different. Is that what
well,
you're trying
okay, one reason is access. But the second reason for the difference in reaction is, of course, Ukraine is a recognized international state. And I think a big factor in the Chechen War, Second Chechen War, a big factor in Putin's actions was 9/11. So with 9/11, the world really turned, the Western world, the US, Europe, really turned against Islamic extremism. And Chechens were seen as
portrayed at least. Right,
portrayed as a mini Afghanistan. So why would you support another small Afghanistan of extremists? Also, the nature of the foreign fighters, etc. Second war. The first war is arguably a nationalist liberation movement. The second one is much more of a jihad with external fighters. So I think there was a world, especially Western bias against Chechnya, against sort of rights of Muslims. And Putin played on this very directly, right? We'll cooperate with the U.S. in prosecuting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you give us free reign in Chechnya. And I think he largely got that. So I think this is another factor. The atrocities, there's a lot of discussion of why are some atrocities, why do they get attention and some don't. There's always unfairness in that.
Reporting?
Yes. Well, not just in reporting, but in reaction. That people get interested in certain things and not in others. There's always a racial, ethnic, religious element, but it's not the whole story. I always have had students talking about Darfur and Sudan. And if you say, hey, how about Congo? It's oh, I don't follow that one. Okay. Why does one conflict get, so much interest and another one doesn't? So there's always some of that. So with the Syrian refugees versus Ukrainian refugees, so there's some of that. But I think the media is one piece of it. I think 9/11 is another big piece of it. Also, I think what we argue in this article is that Chechnya is part of Russia. And when you see the way that Russia treats Chechnya, and you see the parallels with the way that they're treating Ukraine, it gives you insight into how they think of Ukraine.
Yes.
That they do not think of Ukraine as an independent state,
Correct.
because their actions are so similar to a constituent part of the Russian Federation.
Yes. So they think that this, whatever, the Ukrainian sovereignty is fake, as fake as the Chechen sovereignty at that time, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, yeah, I think, so my take about Putin was that, he started with obliteration of Grozny and Chechnya. Like, he came to power and just bombed Chechen city and villages into oblivion. I mean, they didn't have anti-aircraft guns like Ukrainians have, and I think the reason why Ukraine is not Grozny is because it was better equipped, not because Russians were more generous towards Ukrainian cities.
But some of the cities, I mean, the Mariupol and Grozny pictures are the same. I mean, the total destruction, literally bombing to smithereens, is very similar.
Yeah.
And also the attitude of like, we just do this, and so what?
Yeah.
So what? Like, who cares if we do this? Like, this attitude of like, this is a completely acceptable action on the part of Russia is very similar.
And so they did it repeatedly, right? So he started with a small place, like Chechnya is like a tiny place, and then he continued with Georgia, slightly bigger country, completely sovereign country actually, and then it also worked out. The U.S. didn't impose sanctions. I mean, really, and then they obliterated Aleppo like they did with Grozny. Very similar sort of picture. Syria, again, Syrians didn't have anti-aircraft weapons and so on. And in Ukraine, I think a lot of it was this using air force to obliterate the cities, and it just so happens that it didn't work. And maybe one way of thinking of Putin was that every time he obliterated some place and took it over, his popularity and strength within the elites and within society was increasing. And how much of the Ukrainian invasion was that, I pulled it off in 4 places, and how can I not pull it off in the 5th? Like, do you buy that fact that Ukraine was just like a convenience rather than strategy?
Okay, I think that he was buoyed by former military successes, and like his way of looking at it would be, we were successful in Chechnya, we were successful in Syria, we were successful in Georgia, we got away with it.
Crimea, sorry, I missed that one.
Yeah, but I'm not sure showing people pictures of Mariupol per se boosts his popularity, but I think he definitely thought, we will take this military action, and this could for sure. They thought Crimea was a boost to popularity. Now, I'm not a person that thinks. Some people argue his popularity is lagging, the economy's lagging. He needs to do this.
One of the questions. So he
needs to do this for economic reasons. I don't.
You don't buy it? Okay.
No, I think that they might have thought. I think they clearly thought the Ukraine war would go easier, that it would be quicker, and they would win, and they thought they could withstand the sanctions. So I think they thought that, but that's different from saying the reason that they invaded was just to boost their popularity or just because the economy was sagging. I think this is way too cynical, and it ignores the larger ideological imperial lens with which they're operating. So I think it's not just about like some random way to increase popularity. I also think with Assad in Syria, this wasn't just a popularity mechanism for the regime. The regime is anti-Western.
Correct.
And they do not want a Western victory.
Yeah.
So as the West was saying, we want Assad out, the Putin, and actually to some extent China position is, no, we don't like revolutions. We like dictators to stay in place. We don't like protests to be successful. We don't like the West to be able to change regimes successfully. So in the last minute, he's going to go in and support Assad, which he did. And with Russia's support, Assad managed to hang on. Yeah. So I don't think it, and I mean, what's significant about Syria is Russian military operations had been, until then, confined to former Soviet space.
Correct. Yeah.
They were not operating like the U.S. global war on terror, literally all over the world. So in some ways, they were more constrained to the former Soviet space. But I think with Syria, it was about preserving a dictator against revolution, because Putin is very anti-revolution, and stopping the West from having a victory.
But also, like, show of force component of Syrian campaign was, I felt like, it was very highly televised. You know, they had a concert in Palmyra. You know, like the bomb, like the capabilities of Russian Air Force was shown. And then, if you remember, I mean, probably some of our listeners do remember, they shot rockets from Caspian Sea using Navy into Syria, crossing many countries. And it was this sort of show of force that we can use multiple ways of attacking, both through the sea and air and land. What was like really highly televised, and I remember sort of watching it, and even in Uzbekistan or other places that I kind of follow closely, it was like, oh my God, Russia is like back. It's a superpower, right? Like,
well, even in the U.S., if you look at like 2017 U.S. Defense Intelligence analysis, I mean, a lot of the analysis from intelligence in the U.S. Was on the basis of the Syrian operations of Russia, saying Russia had reformed its military, etc. Now, some people actually, like Zoltan Barney, who actually wrote about failed Soviet military reform in the 2000s. He had another like kind of follow-up article in 2023 come out saying, like, don't be fooled by Syria. This wasn't a real test of the Russian military, and many of the same problems that they had before of corruption, of this command structure that's very one-sided, etc., haven't been solved. And I think he's turned out to be correct.
Very few people were right on this, right? Like, I felt like when the war started.
Yes. Well, yes. Okay, so I think Zoltan Barney, who's at Texas, he's one of the people that was correct. Well, he studies militaries, and so he wasn't convinced of Russian military reform, and so he was right. But this leads into the U.S. and other analysts' belief that Russia would win so quickly in Ukraine, that Ukraine would fold and Russia would win because they overestimated Russian capabilities.
But it's including the U.S. government. I felt like, you know, they evacuated their embassies, and they thought this is going to be like a 4-day war or 10-day war, like very, very short-lived, right? Yeah. So why do you think this hubris was also present? Is it because only of Syria, or there was other things that Putin did that made him sort of invincible?
Why did Russia think they could win?
No. Why did the West thought that Russia's military is like 9 feet tall, right? Like, I remember being on Twitter, doom scrolling before the war, and everybody's like, "Oh, this is going to be Sputnik moment," or like, you know, even like mainstream sort of CNN and New York Times were reporting, saying, you know, the difference in military capabilities are so vastly unequal that, you know, Ukraine stands no chance of resisting and so on. And even I think Biden calling Zelensky saying, "Do you need a ride?" or something, right? Like, it kind of shows that even sort of White House didn't believe that Ukrainian president can actually survive the invasion.
I mean, this is like at the end, at kind of the edge of my expertise, when I'm not a military person, but I think that a lot of military people look at the material capabilities. So the number of tanks, the number of aircraft, number of ships, amount of munitions. Now, so if you compare Russia per se and Ukraine per se, there's like a massive advantage of Russia. But if you think Ukraine has the support of NATO countries, and you look at the combined GDP of Ukraine supporters versus combined GDP of Russian supporters, then the advantage really shifts to Ukraine. But I think the military analysts were looking strictly at Russian military assets, Ukrainian military assets, and discounting factors like resolve or willingness to fight and organization and stuff like that. So I think they were not, I mean, that's why I think there was a divergence between area experts and military experts, because I think most area experts thought, I mean, what area expert would say, oh, you know, Ukrainians, although they've been talking about Holodomor like every day since 1991, like they'll just decide they don't care about that anymore. I mean, no, they're not going to give up on these things. They're not going to give up on not being subjugated to Russian, Soviet, Putinist kind of power. So I think there was just a divergence of area experts thinking that Ukrainians really were not like one way or another. You know, not in a kind of professional, objective assessment of like, here's how the Ukrainian resistance is going to work out, but just this view of like, somehow they're not going to take it. And this looks kind of weak, I guess, compared to here's how many tanks there are, here's how many aircraft, etc. So I think that Russia did have a material advantage by a lot, and they, you know, maybe people underestimated why they lost it. I think the poor execution of the war is another. I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting questions that will come up. Like, one, the lack of coordination between the land, air, navy from Russian side. The you know, the giant tank columns. Where was the Russian Air Force in terms of providing cover for? Where was the combined arms kind of approach? Why didn't they have that?
I think it comes from the hubris, right? Like they thought there's so much advantage that they don't have to think through it militarily. And to add to this point, I think in Kiev Oblast, they showed a lot of cars that were belonging to Russian Rosguardia, which is basically a police force, not a how do you call it? Not like a military. And then there was a few trucks that had parade uniforms. In them, so they thought they're going to parade through the Kiev.
Okay,
right?
But I would argue, I guess, as somebody that works on identity, this kind of hubris, it's not just a miscalculation, not just based on prior military victories, but this is imperial myopia. This is the empire saying, I don't need to study this place, okay? We're the best military. We can just roll our tanks in there, and those people will just submit. We don't need to look at public opinion polls. We don't need to look at military changes in Ukraine since 2014. We don't need to look at Zelensky election results. We do not need to study Ukraine at all because they're not worthy of our, they're not like an equal enemy to us. So I think this imperial myopia, you can call it imperial hubris, but this imperial lens leads you to not see what the people there are doing.
Or are capable of.
Yeah, so it's not just like I happen to not have that information. It's that because I think of myself in
so highly,
I don't study things I need to study.
Yeah, I felt like that too. So when you know, if you go to like a Russian think tanks or like government affiliated places, there are a lot of people who study like American military or American public opinion or whatever. But like when it comes to Ukraine or like former Soviet countries, I think Russia has the highest myopia levels when it comes to their subjects. So like you know, there are a lot of people who are like Americanologists or like people who study America for a living in Russia, or people who study Europe for a living or whatever. But there are very few people who study, I don't know, Kazakhstan in Russia. Although they have the largest border. And I feel like this is because
if you think of status, like somebody would say, I studied China, I studied the Middle East, I studied America. But saying like, oh, I studied Kazakhstan, like this is not like, oh wow, I'm so like, tell me more, you know. This is kind of not as high status. And this could be true not just in Russia, but in other countries too, that you can imagine like why people study certain things. Now, this is a problem of you know, it's just assuming that you know things or assuming it's not going to be a problem. I mean, it could be you assume you know it. It could also be you assume it's not a problem and therefore you don't have to study it.
Yeah, because I feel like in Russia, like whatever the think tanks study, it very much depends on what are the priorities of the government. In the U.S., it's a lot. I mean, U.S. may share the same problems in terms of myopia in some instances, right? Like, I would assume in military as well. But like in terms of what people focus to study, it's more decentralized. And in Russia, sort of the orders to study, like research, basically comes from the top, not from like the people. And it felt bizarre that, for example, I mean, I'm interested in Uzbekistan, and I would think that the empire next to us would be studying us relentlessly, because there are 37 million Uzbeks now, 5 million live in Russia, and there's like surprisingly little thing. I'm not even sure how many Uzbek-speaking people or like Uzbek-speaking researchers are in like top Russian foreign relations, think tanks. There are like handful, and if at all, right?
Yeah, and probably even less now, given what's happened
Correct,
in 2022.
Right? And so
I heard Tajikistan with this recent.
Like the lack of expertise about the region, that they think that it's theirs. It's almost a tell, right? Like, that's an angle I never thought of in terms of myopia. Like, it's a deliberate, like, it's almost, how can I say? It's not a policy, but it's a short.
Well, it's how your identity shapes the things you think are important to you, and or worthy of your study. And so you're going to leave out some things, and that's not because you have objectively said like what is important, what's not important. It's because you have this way of looking at the world that tells you what's important or not important. So, and sometimes this turns out to be wrong. I mean, this turns out to leave a hole that people should be focusing on.
Interesting.
Especially if you're going to invade. I mean, this is the most ridiculous thing, that you're going to invade. But you can imagine scenarios where people don't think something is likely. So they say, the boss wants to know, how long would it take to occupy Ukraine if we invaded?
Yeah.
And somebody would say, well, like, that's ridiculous. Like
4 days or something.
Well, or just like, why would I do the analysis?
Yeah.
Because that event is not going to occur. So I'm not going to actually, I'm not going to actually do work.
Entertain that.
Because it's probably not going to happen. So you just ask me this question, and I say 3 days, and then they take it as, oh, they said it would only take 3 days. But that was based on, so that's another way of just looking at it in terms of bureaucratic politics, that because of the information flows in Russia, they're not actually interested in dissent, right? So they weren't saying like, hey guys, like, let's talk about the pros and cons of invading Ukraine and a full-scale invasion. Like, what's likely to happen? I seriously doubt. I mean, look at the look at the press conferences with the, National Security Council and all that, right? They're not taking like, oh, let's have an open back and forth about
it's not a deliberation
happen.
Rather than like,
So they wouldn't. So even if somebody knew something, that's not a context in which they're going to discuss it.
Yeah, I mean, now what it reminds me is that I was reading this book by Steve Cole about Saddam Hussein. It's a recently published book. And there's like a small feed where Saddam basically bans study of Israel by Iraq. They think it's their main sort of arch enemy, but he like bans people learning Hebrew or like even studying it. And it kind of resonates a lot about Russia. And it's just like, I don't think a lot of people like study Ukrainian military or capabilities for a living. That's a very interesting point. In your early work, you researched how the perception of economic performance can be as important, if not more important, than the actual sort of economic metrics. And now I feel like there's two questions I want to ask out of it. So one is that if I read Russian media, both sort of oppositional and the pro-government, they talk about how good the economy of Russia is right now. So like, the West wanted to sanction us, it didn't work out, this is the government line. And the opposition line is that, Russian economy is better than we thought it would be. Like, people are saying it would be in shambles. This is one question. The other question is in the US. I think right now the term du jour is, they call it vibe session. So the economy is really, really good, but the vibes aren't there. So any survey in the US shows that the perception of the state of the affairs is really poor. So given your study of the perception, can you tell me more about it?
Okay, so one is, my first book was called Imagined Economies, and it was about how people understood the economy in the 1990s and the Soviet collapse. And especially, I was interested in blame, like whether you think, oh, the economy is bad because price of oil is low and it's bad all over, or do you think the economy is bad because those people in Moscow are sticking it to us and they're taking everything and giving us nothing? So you can have good and bad, but you can also have attribution of blame. Is the blame because of a general situation, because of specific, etc.? So for sure in the US right now, there's like both the denial of reality, like inflation is super high, gas prices are super high. Well, okay, they're not actually, but so there's like wrong information. But there are certain kinds of problems, like housing prices are really high, and that's like really problematic for a lot of people. So people's understanding of their situation, even if they're one view is that there's information, it's objectively understood, and if I might say, economists tend to have this view that in the past, before the behavioral economics revolution, right, that is like I will understand the true economy. And then I will tell that to people, and people will understand that, and they will make decisions, on that basis. Another view is to say, well, people can be wrong about that. Like the true economy is that inflation is moderate, not high, and so somebody is mistaken. Another way to look at it, like the more radical approach, is there isn't one correct interpretation. There's multiple legitimate understandings. And this gets to be a little bit fuzzy constructivist, but you can see on some things, like if you say inflation, like okay, general inflation isn't as high nearly as it could be in historical terms, but housing prices are going up, and housing is more unaffordable than it's been in a long time, and so people aren't really wrong about that. That's a correct interpretation, that aspect of inflation is correct, right? So another way to look at it, or like you look at the cost of the war. Well, what if my car factory is now making military vehicles or something like that? Like, well, maybe it's okay. Like, so it's not like the economy isn't doing worse because I still have a job. Like, that's a legitimate way of interpreting that. So there's always like some wiggle room in how you see things. But there's also like limits to those interpretations that get to be, false. Like, I mean, in the current case of Russia, it's amazing to me that opinion polls say that, do you think Russia's going in the right direction? And let's say it's like yes, right? 70 to 80% say yes. And I just think, okay, come on. Because we know certain things. We know that when you have one single investor, which is the state, which is basically what's happened in Russia, you're basically going to repeat a lot of the problems of communism, right? So it doesn't take, it's not like, oh, well, maybe it'll be fine if there's only one investor and Russia is totally cut off from external capital markets. No, that's going to limit growth in the long term. You're not going to get around that. So I think that there is some objective facts about the economy that people are in, either they don't know or they're in denial about. But there's also ways in which you can see how they could interpret something as, one way or another, reasonably so. So I think if somebody thinks the economy is like temporarily a little bit bad, but it's going to get better, okay, people have those beliefs, but the future will tell whether it's going to get better or not. So I still think, the perception of the economy politically is as important as the objective situation. But the objective situation matters too, unless you're like completely detached from reality, right? So at some point, we know the components of growth, right? We know the components of GDP. We know that Russia is hiding some parts of it, like net exports, right? So should I listen to GDP estimates from Russia today and just take them at face value? Like, I think that would be a mistake.
But like general sort of the vibe in Russia is that although there is a war, we are doing fine. Maybe they kind of calibrated their expectations. They thought because of the war we'll have, I don't know, rationed bread, but now, they have every every imaginable food. You can buy Coca-Cola there. It could be Iranian, it could be more expensive, but then there's still Coca-Cola. And
so I think an important thing that the Putin regime did since the 2000s actually was focus on food security.
Yeah.
And actually that's pre-Crimea, pre-war. They were very intent on...
and very conscious about it, right?
Yes, on food security as a regime stabilization, tactic, a stabilizing regime support. But I think it comes to like quality of life, things are harder to measure. I mean, there's these funny videos going around of like, you can buy a car in Russia, but it doesn't have, seat warmers, it doesn't have airbags, it doesn't have like those backup cameras or whatever. And you could say like, well, I don't really need those.
Yeah.
But okay, these things, these consumer things, you can say they don't matter. But the consumer discontent is a big part of the denigration of Soviet and communist ideology. These claims in the 70s that we're living just as well as in the West, people knew this was not the case. So this thing isn't going to turn the regime in, overnight, but I think that those things matter. I think medical procedures, different ways in which life is going to be affected, those things add up in the long term, even though for sure Russia has been able in the short term to kind of paper over the problems.
So I feel like I consume a lot of Russian media. When I kind of consume, like when I watch it and so on, I feel like what they're saying is, you can buy any car in Russia basically. It's just more expensive than it used to be, or than it should be, and same thing with all the goods. Like you can buy, Italian cheese or whatever, because there's a lot of ways to alleviate the sanctions, and it's more expensive. And I think, my take was that for some reason they perceive the economy to be better than they thought it is, and that's what they're giving a mileage. Mm-hmm. They're like, they thought we're going to be hungry, but now look at us. Now we're having caviar or whatever. Yeah. Like that sentiment is very, very kind of strong.
So they lowered expectations
drastically,
expecting like a big collapse. And I have to say, to be fair, like a lot of people in the West, including myself, expected the financial situation to be much worse in Russia. And unfortunately, like these bureaucrats like Nabulina, etc., did a better job than expected.
So this is it fortunately or unfortunately? So like in one way they would say, I'm not sure about her in particular, but they would say, what we're doing is not for Putin's regime per se, but for the well-being of our people. Like the kids would get baby formulas, and like there is this kind of saving the country, although the Tsar is bad. So how would you reconcile that?
Okay, well, I'm in favor of, baby formula for everybody.
Yeah,
but
obviously.
On the luxury cars, not so much. So I think, you don't wish widespread hunger or famine or anything like that. But, and I think a lot of bureaucrats and people in the army too. I can understand and you can understand this looking at Nazi Germany, etc., that, like, let's say somebody like Surovikin or one of these people is like, okay, my job is to organize defensive lines, and we're going to dig trenches, and we're going to stop Ukrainians from, getting through. And so my job is to figure out how to make these trenches effectively, right? Yeah. You can imagine a person that's like, this is my whole career. I'm in the military and I'm an engineer, and like I'm just doing that. Okay, so it's not really shocking to me that a person would just keep doing their job like that. Somebody working in an office, processing,
they're fighting inflation.
Yeah, pension payments. Okay, they're just doing what they were doing. So I understand that. So I understand like a lot of aspects of people working for the state that just keep working for the state despite the state, going in the wrong direction. So I do, from a human perspective, understand that. But on a larger perspective, like everyone that's helping the Putin government appear stable is also helping the war effort and helping Putin wage this war against Ukraine. So they were pensions paid. It's
a difficult sort of dilemma, right? In some sense, for decision makers.
I think it was difficult. From an abstract perspective, it's not difficult. It's you shouldn't support the regime. Okay, that's easy. From the individual perspective, it's just the same as the protester, right? Like, if you're an adult, you have no one is depending on you. You have nothing to lose. Like, it might be easier for you to go out on the street. If you're taking care of your parents or kids or something, people are depending on you, it's much harder for you to say, okay, I'm going to just stand up to the FSB now and get arrested and be in jail and no one, takes care of my kids or my family members. So I do understand, like, on an individual level, it's harder for people to not kind of just keep doing what they're doing, even though the state overall is bad. On an abstract level, I think it's easy, but when it comes to the actual choices people make, I think it's harder.
Yeah, that's what I hear. Like, I have friends in Russia, obviously, who are like running like competition among kids on mathematics, for example. And they're like, so if I protest, then this competition won't happen.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't happen, how is it going to really help the war effort or hurt war effort? And they kind of, at least, I mean, they may tell it for themselves or to me, I don't know. But the point they say is that their protest or walkout or whatever is not going to help Ukrainian kids or Ukraine, but it also may hurt a lot of kids that depend on them, or a lot of other teachers or many stakeholders. So every job we do, some people depend on it, like a neurosurgeon in Russian hospital. Like, he can protest, but there will be 200 kids who cannot get their surgery because he's in Aftazak, right? Like, and so they have this really hard moral dilemmas, and that makes the regime a lot more sustainable than.
But that, the regime, that's true. But I mean, like, as Navalny would say, like, okay, maybe you can't do everything, but like, try for 5 minutes a day to do something. And I think it's worth thinking about, like, I don't know, given the constraints, what can you do? I think that is worth thinking about, even in a totalitarian regime. It's worth thinking about, like, what could I do? That's one thing. Second, but I don't want to seem like I'm judging people because I'm not facing arrest and all that. So, but I think, like, ideally, it would be good for people to think about what they could do. But another thing would be to understand that the regime depends on everybody thinking that everybody else is a regime supporter.
Yeah.
This is the Václav Havel greengrocer. This is the Timur Kuran now out of Never. And this is the Navalny call to say, like, come on, they can't arrest all of us. If just like a small percent of people would just stand up to the regime would crumble. And I think that's true, but like, that collective action is so hard because the regime keeps pushing this message that nothing you do will make a difference, that you are alone, nobody cares about you. So you have to kind of think of, like, this is the regime message, that nothing I do matters. Yeah. So how can I not
see that, right? Yeah, collective action problems are so difficult. But in general, like, a meta point about, like, so Russian problems, if you will, why do you think Russia wasn't able to democratize or reform the way other Eastern European countries, like we just mentioned, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Baltic states were able to? What was the secret thing that didn't let?
This is also a matter of interesting intellectual debate. Just last week we had Serhiy Plokhy speaking here. One of the top Ukrainian historians. And historians tend to look in the long view and say, okay, Russia was actually never a democracy. And even in the 90s, it was flawed. And so, I mean, kind of a little bit of a caricature of the historical view is to say, like, because you weren't a democracy before, we shouldn't expect it now. I mean no
country was a democracy, right? At some point,
I hate to be so historically, I'm not saying that's what Plokhy was arguing. I'm just saying I don't like to be so constraining, where history is so constraining, that just because you didn't do this before, you're not going to do it now. But it's a little bit different to say it's unlikely that this would change given what society is like, given different kinds of things. Now, I don't know, for sure in Ukraine, it absolutely mattered that they protested in 1991, in 2004, in 2013-14. The Orange Revolution and Euromaidan is just vitally important to the history of Ukrainian democracy, where they have had a change of an incumbent every single presidency, right? So when you look at that and you look at Russia, you say, like, okay, that's different. Look at what's happening in Georgia now with all these people on the street, right?
In parliament fighting too. Right?
Yes, yes. And that's people saying, no, I'm not going to put up with this. And this is interesting. Like, why do some people say, well, there's nothing I can do. I guess we just have to, like, live with it. And some people say, like, no, I'm going out on the streets. A lot of street protests don't work. So it can't be that that's always the answer. But sometimes they do. So I don't know. There's so many counterfactuals in Russia. Like, what if Yeltsin hadn't started the first Chechen War? Then Boris Nemtsov would not have been against it, and he wouldn't have been out as a successor to Yeltsin. I mean, there's lots of things that, right? Like,
like the road not taken.
Yes.
Like what if?
Yes. What if there have been a lot of different things? What if he didn't run for re-election in 1995? What if they had had a more democratic election in 1995?
If Zyuganov was the president for a while, and then what would happen? Like, there was a theory of Nemtsov, right? Like,
or 96, I guess.
96,
So, I don't know. I don't tend to think it was
predestined to be that, right?
Yeah, I don't think it was predestined. I think that we can look back and say,
But what was like explanatory variables among, like, Soviet Union collapsed, and then Eastern Bloc collapsed. So some places were able to build market economies with sustainable democracies, flawed obviously and so on. But some places were like notoriously not able to do it. And Russia being the main country that weren't able to democratize.
Actually, all the former Soviet states initially, post 1991, there were aspirations in all of those countries
to be democracies.
Yes. I mean, for one thing, in Russia, there was institutionally, structurally, a big problem with a lot of the democratizing reforms had happened at the union level.
Yeah.
And then those union level institutions were, just disappeared, and you're left with the Russian Supreme Soviet that was very communist dominated. Yeltsin had the legitimacy from fighting the coup plotters, but he never had the support of the Supreme Soviet. And then his decision to bomb the parliament in 1993 fall was, I think, disastrous in terms of Russian democracy, because what does it mean to bomb the parliament, right? And then push through this constitution and regional reforms in the fall of 1993 that set Russia on a path of, well, it's kind of democratic, but like actually the president can take force and start also the Chechen War, 1994, the first Chechen War. So there was from the start a number of like critical problems, I would say. Those two, the bombing of the parliament and then the first Chechen War, problematic, but I guess also the lack of support, lack of elections or lack of democratic support in the parliament was a problem. So, I don't know, there was a number of problems. Could they have been overcome? I mean, why was Putin chosen? This was also a historic mistake, right?
Why also quite random too.
That wasn't predestined, I don't think. And his particular brand of cruelty and cult of personality was Russia went.
The alternatives were also like Primakov, or like other KGB officers, like
Lushkov,
like the roster of people who
Chernomyrdin, like all these people,
like all the prime ministers.
Yes.
Who was there? There was Primakov. There was one more guy, right? He was also a KGB person. So I feel like there was a lot of the transition was among the KGB officers, not.
Yes. Well, as I say, I think Nemtsov was a contender until his protest of the first Chechen War, and then he was, he was out. So, I don't know. Maybe that's wishful thinking. I don't think Putin was preordained. It could have been somebody else, and it could have been something.
It could have been a worse path too, right? Like people are afraid that somebody like Primakov, who is hardliner.
But also Putin, when he came to power, I don't think he was set on well, a genocidal war for one thing.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think that goes back to 2000. Although I think the imperial ambitions are there. But the march towards authoritarianism that he starts right from the start is, in retrospect, like really disappointing. Like so many things where there could have been a time for Russian opposition to be
Push back.
Yeah, but they were still like just fighting each other and so ineffective for so long. Even the oligarchs too. You know, his exiling, jailing Khodorkovsky, but also Berezovsky, Guzinski, each one saying like, hey guys, don't worry, it's just this guy. The rest of you are fine. And then like the next one and the next one. And I think Khodorkovsky was really important in retrospect of him telling everybody like, this guy is the richest man in Russia. He has all these foreign friends. And what I'm going to do is go on his private plane in daytime with TV cameras and arrest him, and nothing's going to happen. Everything will be fine. But again, this is post 9/11. He has an absolute free hand domestically from, you know, international
actors.
Yeah. So, like, if there wasn't 9/11, would Russia have had the same path? I don't know.
Okay. So there's one question I think about a lot personally, but I find very little thought or coverage in Russian media, which is sort of attitudes towards non-Russians and primarily towards Central Asians. And being Uzbek man probably gives me some perspective on this. There's huge sort of dehumanization that has been going on for last 20 years. And this issue, sort of dehumanization, seems sort of one of the rare things where sort of opposition and the people in power have agreed on, if you will. And some would argue that for a long time before, especially before the Ukraine war, it was Putin who was more kind of restraining this, the more nationalistic, anti-Central Asian hate, if you will. Then it was the sort of liberal opposition being against it. So how would you explain it? What are the causes or consequences of that? Because it's sort of an elephant in the room. There's like tens of millions of people who are, you know, come across as Central Asian looking. Let's just put it this way, or Caucasian looking. I think they're in the same bucket as the Russian joke goes. Бьют по морде, а не по паспорту, right? So they punch you on the face the way you look, not if you're a Russian citizen or not, right?
Okay, so I think there's a lot of elements here. One is that Putin, the Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic, multinational empire. And so they never really had the idea of like racial purity or something like that. Like it's a multinational empire. But it was hierarchical.
Correct.
Right? So they did always have a view of Russians as better or Slavic people as better. Now they have made this distinction between Russians and Ukrainians.
At that time it wasn't really,
Yeah, I would say even until a few years ago. I mean, there was like a background view, but the anti-Ukrainian sentiment wasn't even something that really registered very strongly as a serious social force, I wouldn't say. But Putin definitely, when he came to power, tried to promote this like Russian nationalism, like Russia, like flag waving, Olympics, like, you know, kind of thing, the Nashi organization, etc. But very quickly, within a few years, they had sparked all this kind of neo-Nazi, white supremacy, like serious Russian nationalists. Yes. Yes. And people may recall that in 2010, there were those riots in Moscow and in some other parts of Russia that were dangerous to the regime. So the regime very quickly turned on these Russian nationalists.
Yes,
and
they put them in jail, many of them, right?
Yes, and disbanded their organizations. And even though this law on extremism, for example, that's used against regime critics now, this was also used against these neo-Nazi Russian nationalist regimes or actors. So a lot of those Russian nationalists were very anti-Putin, and this is clear in survey research that
they were anti-Putin because he was pro-immigration, right?
He was not enough cracking down on immigration.
Exactly, yeah.
So those people, some of them went into Europe. and supported.
Let me interrupt you. Sorry. Not only the immigration, but also he was too soft on Caucasians.
Yes.
Like it's not like immigrants, like
Yeah,
calling
people,
Dagestanis.
Yes.
Sorry.
Not just Caucasians, but people from Central Asian too, and Central Asia
Asian
too.
Caucasian, yeah.
But also like Tatars or just like other non-Slavic
people. He was
people.
too soft on non-Russians.
Yes.
Россия для русских. Russia is for Russians.
Yes. I mean, and Putin, if you look at his rhetoric, you will not find him saying ethno-nationalist statements. He'll say directly, anyone who says Russia for Russians is either an idiot or compromised.
Yes.
So he's careful about that. And for that reason, the extreme Russian nationalists largely were kicked out. They went to Europe. Some of them went to Ukraine. Some of them fought in Ukraine against Russia in this Donbass war because they hate Putin. So, and then, there's the anti-immigrant campaign following later. And then they just abruptly turned that off. I mean, this is an amazing thing on TV that after you got some riots in marketplaces, they just say like, okay, enough of that. They also use very veiled language. Like they won't say, we have too many immigrants in Russia. They'll say like, look at Italy. Look what's happening.
Yeah, or France.
Yes, look at what's happening in Europe. And it will show like scenes of immigrants, right? So they won't say directly like, no immigrants in Russia. They will use this kind of...
I think Navalny said we have to close the borders between...
So Navalny, of course, this is like a very controversial topic because yes, there's no question like in his 20s he said...
No, I mean he campaigned as a mayor to have a visa regime and close the borders between Kazakhstan.
But I guess like the worst things that he said I think were early in his life. But I think the question of immigration, especially from Central Asia, especially with the Russian decline in life expectancy, you can see it over the last 20 years, like much more immigration from Central Asia in working jobs and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think the Putin regime was always trying to balance this, like we're going to allow immigration in, we're going to be kind of nationalist, but not too nationalist. We're going to try to keep a lid on violence, like overt violence, because it can get out of hand. But we're never going to embrace multiculturalism as an equality kind of way. We're never going to do that. But we are going to try to control different elements, not because we love immigrants, but because those nationalist elements could get out of control and threaten us. Mm-hmm. So I think that the attack on Russian nationalists is entirely because of the threat they pose to the regime, not because they have some sympathy with the cause.
But I think have you heard of Sputnik and Pogrom?
Mm-hmm.
Like this whole enterprise or like a blogosphere that was extremely nationalist. They had some friends in Kremlin and so on, right? Like I think I'm blanking on him. Surkov, was that the guy? Like there was a lot of. I mean, like Rogozin would be like the primary example of I'm not sure left and right in the U.S. sense works in Russia, but say. So the most sort of nationalist in Putin's inner circle would be somebody like Rogozin, but even him is a lot more milder than sort of an oppositional figures. Like that's one thing what I'm trying to sort of understand is that why is sort of liberals in Russia and liberals I'm using it in a Russian sense, it doesn't mean the same thing in the United States, I would say, were sort of to the right of Putin in that. Like, I don't understand, why do you think that opposition...
Oh, why were they more anti-immigrant than Putin?
Than Putin, yeah. That's the part I can't, grasp my head around.
Partly, with the, what you mentioned with the Navalny mayoral campaign, this is like an electoral issue. I think this is one reason for making anti-immigrant comments, is to think that it's going to be electorally... popular.
But I think even his recent interviews with Dud, with Yulia Navalny, if you remember, it was a huge... I think Dud asked him about it, and he said, I can't go to Italy if I want to. Why would an Uzbek or Kazakh should be able to come to Russia, right?
I think
he had this policy very much...
Yeah, okay. Yeah, this...
He may have apologized for racist stuff,
Yeah. So... I think that, this is actually related to U.S. immigration policy too, because there's human rights concerns, obviously, but I think one of the reasons the Republicans have bit more support on the issue, is that the basic concept of illegal immigration, a lot of people are like, why would I support that? Like, why would I support if I have to wait in line for something that somebody doesn't wait in line? So I think that, like, framing it as like some people are breaking the rules, or some people just should be allowed to like do whatever they want. I mean, I think this is just, again, like an electoral framing of this.
So do you think that the preferences in Russian sort of liberal elites were calculated electoral talking points, but not their true preferences?
Oh, well, I think that basically not just everyone in Russia, but everyone who studies Russia has to, in light of this war, in light of what we have learned about decolonization, has to evaluate their thoughts and views on things. Because some things just go naturally of somebody, like, of course we should restrict immigration from Central Asia, but not from France. And you have to ask yourself, why would you think that? Why do you think it's a natural thing to say? So, is it their true preferences? I think, no, I think there is an I think the bias and prejudice against non-Slavic people from parts of the Soviet Union is real and widespread. I think this is real and widespread, not just among the least educated people, but also among
elites.
Yeah, among elites. So I think this is a factor.
I have had a personal experience. Sorry to interrupt you again. Is that like sort of very educated Russians would say something bizarre, and they wouldn't realize. They would say something like, "But you know, you're like a normal Uzbek."
Yes.
Or like you're like, they're not like you, or something like so bizarre that you would think that this, like as if like they don't even realize. So sometimes when people say mean things, they mean to like hurt you or say it like deliberately. But sometimes I see their discussion like in higher school of economics or like in a very kind of educated circles, we would say very progressive circles. Sorry for that language, which is not precise in Russian terms, right? But like you would see like a normal looking people saying something bizarre like, "Oh yeah, she's Kazakh, but not the Kazakh that you think," or some bizarre statement that follows this, and it's invisible to them. And so I wasn't sure how, like, why this, where this comes from, sort of, like that's the thing I don't understand.
Well, I think, there could be unconscious prejudice. Mm-hmm. And sometimes people would be conscious of existing prejudice and think that they're being helpful by exposing something. I mean, for example, in these recent cases of the Supreme Court here, getting rid of affirmative action in higher education, this was this case at Harvard, and it was among Asian American students also were part of this case. And one case that struck me was there was an Asian American guy, who had a letter writer, an alumni guy wrote a letter for him. And because he was part of this case, like the letter that the alumni wrote for him became public. And basically the letter was saying, this guy is not your average Asian American. You should admit him because he's like much better. And
he's not like a nerd or something.
Well, so the guy was trying to help him out, right? So he wasn't acting against him. The letter writer is almost acknowledging, I expect the people reading the letter are going to be prejudiced. Okay. And so I'm trying to say he's not like a member of that group.
Yeah.
But it's very hurtful to the kid who subsequently developed like a nice relationship with the guy because the guy was his helped him out in his life, literally helped him in his life. But then it's like, it's kind of hurtful to see that's the way that help occurs, is to acknowledge these kind of prejudices. So I think there is, to me, there's no question that there is a widespread bias. Bias comes in lots of ways. In America, for example, there was a lot of ignorance of group differences.
Yeah.
So, for example, just from myself, Yoshiko Margaret Herrera, I could go a lot of places and people would be like, "Oh, what a strange name! Like, I don't know what to make of it." In America. Yeah. Anywhere I went in Russia, people would say, "Okay, you could see the wheels turning. Okay, Japanese, Spanish, okay, female, American. And there was literally like a hierarchy of all 200 countries.
Yes, yes.
And we're trying to put, where are you?
Like a pigeonhole, you right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And like, okay, Japan, like, yes, we like ikebana, we like sushi. Like, okay, good.
Yeah.
Spain,
Nuts.
Europe, but it's okay. Like,
Yeah.
okay, like, okay, it's fine. Like, you're fine, right? And also they're checking, like, you're not Jewish, right? This is also, for American scholars, American students, if you have like Germanic kind of sounding name, you have dark hair, it's like, this, like, are you Jewish? Like, people want to know. Yeah, in Russia.
Oh, I see.
Yes. So they're always looking to know, like, precisely place you. Like, where are you?
In the hierarchy,
In a hierarchy, yes, for sure. Like, oh, you're Vietnamese. No one in Russia is going to say that's the same thing as being Japanese.
Of course, yeah.
But in the U.S., it's like, I don't know, whatever.
Matter,
They're the same. Who knows what's the difference of these countries? So, you know, you have a different kind of prejudices or stereotypes. Like, you have really ignorant masses in America that wouldn't say there's particularly any difference between China and Japan, right?
Yeah.
Maybe now with the anti-China sentiment, but not so much. And in Russia, it's a very hierarchical, very detailed assessment of people, you know, that you will never find in the U.S. You'll never find someone in America saying, well, let's see, okay, you're from East Africa, but you're from Ethiopia, and, well, Amharic speakers, like, well, okay, there's a plus and minus of the language being an older language, you weren't colonized, like, okay, this is different from, you know, Sudan, like, no one in America is going to have this level of
detail.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think the hierarchy in Russia is there. It's very pervasive. Oh, it's very, very pervasive, even within Central Asia, or among Russians thinking about.
Or like Kazakhs are slightly better.
Yes, compared to Tajiks or something. Yes, or within the Caucasus
too,
Georgia.
Azerbaijan and Armenia is different than.
Yes.
Dagestan, Kabardino-Balkaria, or.
Yes. So I think that those ethnic hierarchies or national hierarchies are just very pervasive.
I guess my question is, like, how can I say? I mean, it's not a question. Like, it's more like, I mean, I do realize what you're saying. For example, like the fact that, I mean, I've been to Russia many times when I was a kid and so on, and people would say that they would give me a compliment saying, "Oh, you're very smart for an Uzbek" or something, right? Like, this is like a very common thing, or like, "Oh my God, like, how do you speak Russian so well?" Or they would think it's a compliment saying, "You know, at first I never even thought they were Uzbek." Like that's like a compliment. They would think they're like,
ouch.
"Oh, so I have a friend who she's like, you know, obviously Uzbek, but grew up in Russia and went and studied Russian language for a living. So she's obviously fluent and so on. And when she speaks on the phone, and then when she meets a person, they would have this cognitive dissonance of this person who is very good at talking and writing in Russian and looking very Asian.
Yeah.
They would say, "Oh, like, I'm waiting for somebody else." No, this is me. You know, like, this is who you have an appointment with, and so on. So that thing I think is casual, but what I think is in terms of like policy, right? Like, for example, I mean, everybody knows this, like, and whole like jokes about like people not renting their apartments to non-Slavic people, or like people not hiring non-Slavic people, or like, for example, if somebody doesn't pay a salary of a Central Asian worker, you know, police doesn't persecute that. So this comes down to also like policies and then the response to it. And I think you've seen these videos in the metro, if a white-looking guy punches Asian-looking guy, police would look at it, do nothing.
Yeah.
But if like Asian-looking person does something bad to a white-looking person, police would be there. And so we've seen this. So what I'm trying to say is that it seems like this non-Slavic bias, it's not only like casual in like restaurants or universities, but it's also like in very much how this policy is prosecuted. And it seems to be there's no opposition to that part of society. And I wasn't sure where this comes from. And you're saying it's not Soviet, and it's not very Putinesque.
No, it is Soviet.
Oh, it is Soviet. Okay.
It is Soviet in the sense that I think the Slavic bias is part of Soviet period too. I mean, Russia is the boss, right? So I think the friendship of the peoples, I mean, there was, I mean, there are certain differences, but Soviet Union is all about hierarchy of nations, for sure. There was never this universalist view in the Soviet period. So I think that there was bias and prejudice, but at the same time, there was an official policy to mediate some of that. I mean, for sure, the Korenizatsiya, the having each country have its own, each republic have its own leadership, etc. There's a certain recognition, like, yes, you're not as good as us, but we'll try to help you to get better, okay? Mm-hmm. We'll invite you to Moscow to come to learn, to improve yourselves, you know?
Yeah.
So...
to be like us, right?
Yeah, so there's like efforts to address it to a certain extent. But I think in the post-Soviet period, what's gone is like the Soviet kind of facade of friendship, right? It's like we don't even need to. There's no more official policy. There's no official policy that we welcome people. Now we say Russia for Russians, and the government kind of says, well, that's not our official policy, but we're not going to we don't have another policy.
So they don't condone they not support, but they also don't.
Well, they go after
excesses.
People that excessively threaten the regime.
Yes.
Right? But they're not, they're not on TV or in schools saying like, let's focus on, getting along and all this kind of thing. Like, it's Russia, 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 right? So I think, I think compared to the Soviet period, there's much less emphasis on tolerance and friendship and stuff like that on a ideological level. I don't think they really pursue that. And the government itself has pursued some nationalist aims, anti-immigrant campaigns, the anti-Chechen dehumanization is now anti-Ukrainian, anti-Georgian. I mean, you can see public opinion shift towards those target groups very quickly. So yeah, I think it does. I think this everyday prejudice does go into policy.
This? How can they overcome this? Do you think there is any?
Well, they first have to desire to overcome it, right? I'm not sure this regime.
No, but even the society, right? Like even in society, there is no pro-immigrant. No, not even pro-immigrant. Like let's not talk about foreigners right now. Just immigration makes it the waters murky.
Yeah.
But we can really kind of.
Okay.
Zhirinovsky would say, we need to build a wall between Caucasus and Russia.
Yeah.
And 2 years ago, they bombed Chechnya so them not go away, right? So it's kind of.
Right. Okay. So. Well, in my work, focusing on interethnic trust, collaborative work with Andrew Kidd, we focus on costly signaling and taking chances and learning about trustworthiness. So, I mean, on the plus side, I think if you have people from different ethnic, national backgrounds, say, living in the same apartment building or going to the same schools, they actually can get to know each other. And so they might say like, wow, here I was thinking people from Central Asia are this way. Yeah. But then, it turns out like they're not like that because, I have these neighbors and they're like that. So I actually do think that on an everyday basis, there's a lot of opportunities for building interethnic trust, especially when the sense of hostility is not extreme. So like the biases against people from Central Asia, I mean, for example, if you take Russians in Kazakhstan, I mean, I just have done surveys of this actually that.
So like the local Russians or the.
Yeah, local Russians, ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan, they trust ethnic Kazakhs almost as much as they trust ethnic Russians. Like it's almost the same level. Yeah. Kazakhs trust Kazakhs the most and everybody else less. Oh, okay. But Russians in Kazakhstan trust Kazakhs almost as much as they trust Russians. Okay. And you can see in different places like Almaty or places where people have lived together for a long time that there's a basis for overcoming some of these prejudices. So on that score, I'm not like, this is not an intractable, like, this can never change sort of situation. You can see things change, but like the US is a good example of how some groups assimilate and over time, people even forget about the differences, like Irish, Catholics, Baptists, like a lot of different groups that at one time had like a very strong meaning in society, and now it's like, oh, does it, like, I don't know, what does that mean? Just people forget about that as being. Now, other groups like African Americans, and
persistently,
very persistent, like distrust of Asian Americans, very persistent. Although sometimes people can counter stereotypes, I mean, in funny or not funny ways, but like we just had a paper presented here in political science, a survey experiment about attitudes towards Asian American politicians, and it showed that Asian American women who were overweight were considered more American than those that were not overweight.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
So talk about assimilation, right?
Yes. Yes. Now this was a contrived survey experiment. So it wasn't a contrived experiment. So it wasn't like an actual person. But I mean, that was just an interesting thing about like what makes people think somebody's American.
Yeah.
And in this case, apparently being overweight is
for Asian American women, right?
For Asian American women is what does it. So you know, I'm relatively hopeful that people, if they want to, they can overcome biases. But when you have a state and a government that's not interested in that at all, or that's not interested in reducing prejudice in any way, that's not going to police discriminatory housing policy or discrimination of the police or something like that, then you don't have a lot of hope for a government and a society where the official policy is to turn a blind eye.
I see. I guess one of the thoughts that I had about sort of Russian opposition is that, you know, the non-trivial amount of people in Russia, voters too, especially even in big cities, are non-Slavic and non-Russian, like, you know, they're Tatars or Caucasian and whatnot, and they may identify as like sort of Russian as a you know, like there's ethnicity and then there's like sort of nationality, right? So they may have this ethnic background of being like, I don't know, Armenian or Azerbaijani or Georgian or German Russian or whatever, but not Russian. And the fact that a lot of even oppositional figures were not actually tapping into that poll, I find it appalling in terms of even like political calculation. Even sort of cynically, nobody is using them, and the only savior in their eyes was sort of Putin's regime. And I do remember, I think you've seen these pictures every year. There will be like a Kurban Bayram in Moscow, and a lot of people will be praying next to a mosque. And then in this oppositional like Twitter and whatever, it will be, oh, like this is Putin's Russia.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so they would associate that with Putin.
So, you know something that I think is like very interesting about ethnic politics in Russia that goes under discussed in academic circles is Putin has a lot of support from the so-called ethnic republics.
That's what I was trying to say,
okay?
Yeah.
But why is that? And a lot of people are just like, oh, well, you know, they're corrupt or blah, blah, blah. Okay. Well, what makes an ethnic republic, first of all, like, they might or may not be more corrupt, but why are they more able to deliver the vote for Putin than another region? And what is the role of ethnicity in this corruption or vote delivering, right? Because it doesn't really make sense that some of the places that were the most, let's say Tatarstan, like the most pro-sovereignty, wanting to have your own state, etc. Why would some place like that be the most supporting of the Putin regime?
Yeah.
And I think this is just often dismissed as like, oh, well, those
Corruption,
places are
yeah,
backwards.
yeah.
So, you know, they're doing the wrong thing because they're kind of backwards. But I think when you ask yourself, like, what is the role precisely of ethnicity or nationality in the Putin support, it's just not very clear to me what, what accounts for that.
Yeah, so that's the thing I realized a lot, that among sort of minorities, they think that, yeah, sure, Putin is bad for many of them. For Chechens, he literally bombed their cities. But they think that the alternative is worse. And I think it's not true.
Alternative to
No, but like even the sort of hypothetical, like you know, they think that again, I'm not sure it's a true belief, but rhetoric,
that's a hypothesis.
You know,
that's a hypothesis that they think if it's not Putin, it's going to be like, I don't know, Zhirinovsky or
Yeah, I mean, it used to be Navalny when he was
something like
alive,
that.
right? Like, so the Navalny was this pugala that they used.
Yeah, that's possible. But I mean, the whole Putin rhetorical strategy is to say there's nobody but Putin.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. We don't really know what's the potential alternative. But I think what surprises me is why would groups that are so well, just take native language education, or I mean, this was something groups fought for in the 90s to have native language,
for example, right?
Yeah, and then it's really switched to people just being like, okay, we'll just have Russian and like just kind of give up on these things, or have like this on the side. Like, this is kind of surprising.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think there's a lot of commentary on ethnic politics in Russia, like about the army being mostly non-Russian, or atrocities being committed by non-Russians.
Yeah,
I think
so
this is like, show me the evidence first.
No, yeah. So that's exactly what I'm getting at. For example, if you watch sort of oppositional takes, right, they would do something like, oh, this is Shoigu and Putin's army, and most of the soldiers are Buryats, or something bizarre, you know, like, even if it's in percentage terms, in Buryatia, there are a lot more conscripts, for example, even if it's empirically true. You know, it's a hell of a take to say that most of the army consists of Buryats or anything. They use even words like Peshmerga or stuff like that to kind of say that this is, like, Russians cannot do that kind of but again, like, you're kind of hitting on the nail.
Even
like,
the Pope said that.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Pope, So, but Pope, I think, he kind of reads the Russian oppositional figures, right? And so
he's reading, I think, the Putin.
Really? But Putin doesn't say it's minorities who are fighting in my army.
No, but
so the minorities are fighting line comes from like sort of this sort of Navalny and their team used to say this a lot.
So, okay, I just want to say, I think Navalny, I don't like to criticize him because I think it's not that he's not worthy of criticism. I just think he's asking everyone. Asking everyone in Russia to stand up to the regime, to ask for something better, and the vast majority of people are not doing that.
Correct. Yeah.
And a lot of people, like pro-Ukraine people who I really respect, are just like, and Navalny doing this, that. Why was his letter from prison so bad? Why didn't he write a better letter from prison? And I think, okay, I, as a political scientist, I can criticize some of these things, but I think there's, 140 other million Russians that are worthy of criticism for saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And among the Russian liberals too, I think, okay, there's other ones too that can be the target versus the person that actually tried to stand with the regime and that was killed. So, but why? But I agree with you that there's a lot of people, in both non-liberal and liberal, who claim that non-Russian, non-ethnic Russians are the one committing atrocities and things like that, or claim Chechens are, etc.
Yeah.
And I think, again, I think this is like a leftover background way of thinking that finds expression, right? And the people should ask themselves, do you have any data that says atrocities were mostly committed by non-ethnic Russians versus ethnic Russians? And also, I mean, I talked to a guy in Ukraine who said to me at one point that he had heard a lot of Chechens committed these Chechen units committed atrocities. And I was like, okay, like, do you really think so? Like, what about you? Do you think ethnic Russians are less, deserving?
Susceptible to that?
And he was like, hold on. No, I'm not saying that. He's like, I'm saying, I have heard these Chechen units were particularly brutal. But who's flying the airplanes and all this are Slavic Russians who deserve all of our criticism as well, and they're just as responsible for war crimes, etc. So, but there was like a lot of discussion going around about Chechen units, which I'm no fan, obviously, of Kadyrov, but I also think it's like an easy thing for people to say, to blame things on Chechens,
because they're so dehumanized.
Yes, and I generally say, when you're saying something that's corresponding to some kind of background ethnic stereotype, you should ask yourself, is it really correct? Or is there evidence for that? I'm not saying you should just deny it always, but you should ask, is that actually true? And what's the evidence that that's true? And I don't think so far, I would love to see the ethnic breakdown in the Russian army and with these convicts and with all this, and see what who is actually committing. Oh, I mean, we would like to see, of course, full legal process for all of the war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine and Chechnya, etc. But I mean, this is going to be a long time coming. But I would not jump to ethnic stereotypes first, and I think people should be very careful about that.
I agree with you. Yeah, I guess my thinking was, why does the sort of an opposition do that? Like that's the thing I cannot understand, because there seems like there's no brownie points for doing that. There's no sort of political calculus. Like if
yeah, could be just lazy.
Lazy.
Well, lazy, and just like things come to people that are, well, I mean, as I say, like I think this imperial hierarchy is a background way of thinking
for both opposition and the
yes,
and
it's pervasive, and it's not easily gotten rid of.
I see. Yeah, because I feel every time, like for example, there's a crime that is committed by, like, say, Tajik right now, and then I saw all this data saying that sort of foreigners in Russia apparently do a lot less crimes, especially the violent ones. But then, you know, both sort of opposition and the mainstream media is like, no, they are the main crime.
Yeah, but that could be also, I mean, that could be just like blatant racism on TV. It's, I mean, just like here, you have Trump saying that crimes are committed by illegal.
Yeah. So Trump says this, but then there is some people, like, sort of sane opposition to that rhetoric. What I find perplexing about Russia is that it seems like a cheap brownie point to win, to say, no, you're wrong. You know, not most crimes are committed by foreigners.
I would say you have very few opposition figures in Russia, either in exile or in Russia, that are standing up for the rights of people from the Caucasus or Central Asia.
Exactly.
Like, you just don't find somebody saying, like, a lot in favor of those groups at all. So, and maybe...
And why do you think is that?
I don't know. I mean, it could be people's experience and background, for one. I mean, it might be different if you had, like, an ethnic Russian, say, from Kazakhstan, might speak differently than somebody that, you know, just grew up in Russia. So it could be experience. It could be just prejudice. I mean, some things just literally wouldn't occur to somebody. It's like, oh, it never occurred to me to stand up for the rights of these people. You know, and why would it not occur to them? Because for some reason they're not connected to other people's experience, and they don't have that empathy for, you know, for various reasons. But also, it's not necessarily electorally a winning
popular
strategy. But again, like, you know, you have all these ethnic republics in Russia, so it's not that, but they're not necessarily united. They're not united. And people like Shoigu don't, like, discuss his, you know, non-ethnic Russianness, you know, right? So they kind of just leave it as a background factor that they don't talk about. But, I mean, that's a good question. It's a good question about Russian opposition and speaking up for non-ethnic
and it's not a new thing, though. It's throughout the years. I remember vividly, like, sort of Russian progressive journalists covering Chechen wars in such a dehumanizing manner, and it would say, like, oh, like, I mean, they're covering Chechen wars, but they talk about, like, treatment of Chechens in Russia and saying, like, they deserve every bit of violence against them, and, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, this is
again,
I mean,
like,
probably
progressive people, not like
yeah.
a pro.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard for me as a foreigner. It's hard for me to really feel the anti-Chechen sentiment that is in Russia. I mean, I can see it in surveys. I can see it in things that people say, but I find it hard to fully understand. But you can just see that very, very clearly.
Yeah, and then lived experiences are also really hell of a sort of take. I was in Moscow, I think in 2018 or 19, like for a summer school in Resh, in New York Language School. And so I spent like 5 days there, or 6 days, and then the 7th day I was hanging out with ethnic Russian from Uzbekistan. So like he's grew up in Uzbekistan, whatever. But he's like ethnically Russian, and he was with a friend of mine who's Uzbek, so they are friends. So we're going somewhere, and then so sort of they casually talk about like having a passport, and I said, "Oh, I don't have my passport with me," and the guy almost like stopped the car, freaking out, saying, "How are you not having your passport around? You've been here for like 7 days or 6 days or something." I was like, "No, nobody asked me, and I never like thought." And he's like, "No, like this is like," he described my behavior as being such a reckless thing. He said like, you obviously look Uzbek, and if any cop arrests you and you don't have a passport, you're going to a police station and you're going to spend the night there. Like, why? Like, what kind of insane thing you're doing? And I'm sure like he wouldn't. I mean, he said like, first thing he said, you don't look Russian. Like his first thing, like, that what you're doing is actually super bad. And I was like, oh my God. So he does look Russian. So he's kind of taking care of me, sort of like. He didn't say that, but almost it was like, if you would look like me, I would understand why you're not having a passport. But with a face like yours, this is insane. Like that was like. But
this is true. I mean, this bias against people on the subway and whatnot was there like since when I first visited Russia in 1993. Yeah. I mean, it's different for women. It's different for foreigner women than. I mean, there's a gender difference. There's what you look like, what you're carrying.
Yeah, and how you dress.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So there's a lot of factors that would. But I knew I had a landlady who had a daughter that was a few years younger than me. So she was like, let's say in the 90s, like 25 or so, and she's like she had like I don't know, like brown hair, but like looks white, let's say, from an American perspective, could be Russian, whatever. Does not look from the Caucasus or Central Asia. But she was walking outside her building and didn't have her passport with her, and she was stopped by police, and it was a very unpleasant experience for her. And it was the first time like she was stopped for not having a document. Oh, wow. Yeah, and like I remember that incident was like surprising to everybody. Like, how could that have happened to you? Like, what happened? Like,
to
why
you?
Did it? Yes.
Right, like to like a conventional.
Yes, but just kind of. I mean, and then of course for foreigners, it's like we don't walk around with ID. So this was, except in Russia,
Yeah.
Although for myself, like I wouldn't necessarily have.
Passport in Moscow?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I know that men and other foreigner students did. But I guess I just took my chances and didn't think I would be questioned. Yeah,
I mean, I wasn't though. So this guy freaked out because it's almost end of my, and I walked around Arbat everywhere. Nowhere. Yeah. I mean, if I was stopped, then I would be carrying. Like I just like haven't even. Yeah. It kind of didn't register to me that I have to, because say in Uzbekistan I don't carry a passport, right? So I was thinking, why should I carry? Right. I mean, I don't carry a passport anywhere. To be fair. Yeah. And so that was something I realized that how like for some sort of people you have to have your IDs and papers because they may think you're and illegal immigration, that's why it's so limited. Like if you're illegally in Russia, you'll be deported like you can't take a train, you can't take a bus, you can't take a
and this is a big difference actually I think for Americans because we don't even have a national ID card.
Correct.
It's by state. Everything is by state. And you will be surprised how complicated it is even to move like from New Jersey to Wisconsin, like, and to get a Wisconsin driver's license. It's not that easy.
No, but like if you walk in the streets in America, police doesn't have a right to stop and check if you have immigration documents.
Yeah, not
Not
in
the
Wisconsin,
conventional
but
policy.
I think this is actually one of the things they're working on in these southern
really?
states like Texas. Yeah,
Oh,
I think
okay.
that they are trying to make it. I mean, the tension is that the live free or die mentality says like no national ID card. But obviously, if we had a national ID card, it would be much easier to track people.
Yeah.
But so people are against that, but they also want to stop illegal migrants, and so that's a kind of tension with no national ID card.
I see. Well, let me switch gears before we finish. So, a couple of questions about political science. Do countries need political science and scientists, and why yes or why no?
I think yes, because we need to study. Well, I mean, you can say, do we need to study anything? Okay.
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, if you want to have knowledge about your own country, about other countries, about public policy. I mean, political science is a social science. It's actually very broad social science that covers economics, sociology, like these different topics.
Psychology even, right? Yeah.
Psychology. Yeah, I think that sometimes in Eurasia, it got this, the like politologia has a
Like
kind
a
of
flavor,
sense
yeah.
of like political operatives or working for campaigns or something like that, like something a little bit shady. But I guess if you think about it as like a part of economics that's focusing on the political system and institutions and things like that, like maybe that's a way to think about it. But yeah, I think that if you want to understand various aspects of power, of who gets elected, of how goods and services are distributed, of why there's inequality, and how to address those things, I think you do need political science.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking, I'm not sure you have heard, for a long time in Uzbekistan, political science was banned.
Yeah.
I think you may have heard
Yeah.
about it. Yeah, all right.
I
So,
think this is a little bit of a leftover. I mean, there wasn't political science in the Soviet Union because, you know, you just have Marx and Engels, right? Lenin. So I can understand like negativity towards that type of study, of just like ideologically based kind of study. I think but it's a mistake to like overall ban an overall topic. But even within Russia, like the subfield of the field of political science compared to economics and sociology was never that strong because of the like baggage of the meaning of studying politics.
but even like generally social sciences were not very developed in Soviet Union, I would say.
Yeah.
And so then the next question, Russia tried to build a couple of social science institutions like Высшая школа экономики, and they had political scientists there. And in Kazakhstan, they tried to do Nazarbayev University, and you were involved in it. And so my question would be, you know, what was your experience in building sort of an institution from ground up, if you will, that is kind of, that has to study social science in a very specific context?
Well, okay, so I can say about Nazarbayev University that, you know, overall, like, I have such respect for people who are trying to build an educational infrastructure for other people. So not just to say, like, give me a high salary or give me an award, but saying, I want to do this background work, like setting up the registrar's office, setting up the library, setting up peer-to-peer mentoring. I mean, this was a lot of the work that Wisconsin did with Nazarbayev University, was consulting on the administration of the university. This is not like the fancy front office. It's the back office of the university. And I think this is really, really important work in setting up a university. And I admire the Kazakhstani people who put literally years of their life into trying to create a high-level research university for the country, and all the Kazakhstani students who studied there, who went on to graduate school. So on the one hand, like, I'm very proud of being part of people that were seriously trying to build an educational infrastructure.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, it was always a politicized environment, and the environment unfortunately got worse. It was involved a lot of money, and so when you have like politicized money, this leads to various kinds of challenges. So I think it's not to sugarcoat Nazarbayev University. not to say having this research university that took up so much money, so much of the education budget of the country, that's, debatable, like what it should have been. But the effort of, you think of dictators around the world and what they're doing. Yeah. Like in Equatorial Guinea, they're not building Nazarbayev University. They're not trying to actually create a world-leading research university. So, Higher School of Economics, despite the capitulation post-2022 of that university and most universities in Russia, which is really sad, people were trying to build something, trying to educate people, trying to move knowledge beyond. So, I think those people were working really hard to try to do something and not just build villas in Italy, right? So, like, all the money that went into these big university projects, I think you can debate, was exactly every ruble, dollar, etc., worth it, tenge? Should it have been different? Like, how could it have been different? Yeah. But the effort, the enthusiasm, the dedication to actually building educational institutions, I really support that. And I still think it's important, even under authoritarianism, education is still important. And I hope that somehow those universities survive this period that they're currently in.
I see. Thank you. And so to wrap up, I want to ask you a question. What's your favorite book on Central Asia?
There's a lot of good books on Central Asia.
It could be like a popular, not necessarily sort of a research type of book, but it could be like
yes,
like a biography or not, or fiction or.
Okay. Well, I have a couple of thoughts. Like, one is a recent one on the on the famine, the Kazakh famine. Another, this is a very good book. Actually, a kind of interesting book by Adrian Edgar called Tribal Nation.
It's on Turkmenistan,
which is on Turkmenistan. Yeah. And like, why? Okay, Adrian Edgar is a friend of mine. She has a recent book actually on intermarriage, racial intermarriage in Central Asia. But one thing about why I think this is interesting is like, the research for this is done in the 90s, when you could go to Turkmenistan as a foreigner. And this, in a way, represents, this was a study of nations and nation building in former parts of the former Soviet Union, including in Turkmenistan. And, like, in a way, it represents, like, a kind of hope of people, like, hey, the world is opening up. Like, now we're going to go study things and we're going to talk about things. Yeah. And so it's a kind of, like, moment of, like, this is when it's like a hopeful moment of studying and that kind of thing before this kind of closing down and return of dictatorship in some places. So, and it's a very good book about nation building in Turkmenistan. So, Central Asia remains like a very important place on lots of social science questions. But I think actually national identity, religion, religious identity, state identity, it remains like not just like something to study if you're interested in Central Asia, but if you're interested in nationalism, identity, and these kind of topics generally, I think Central Asia is a very interesting place to study. So I think books like this are good examples of that.
All right. Thank you. This was Yoshiko Herrera. Thanks for being part of the show.
You're welcome. Thank you.